Good evening. Hi, my name is Jonathan Mavroidis. I'm with the Richard Nixon Foundation. Welcome to the Nixon Presidential Library. This is part of our Distinguished Speaker Series, but I still want to make a few announcements before I invite our guest to come to stage. On September 24th, we're going to have Seth Davis. He is the son of Lanny Davis. You'll see him on Fox News, but he's also a Clinton confidant. But Seth Davis is a CBS sports analyst, and he recently wrote a bio about John Wooden. And so he'll be here on September 24th to talk about that and sign books. On October 19th, we're going to have Dr. Ben Carson sign books at the library. There's a Sunday at noon, and tickets are going fast, so please go on our website at nixonfoundation.org. The next day, on October 20th, we're going to have Newt Gingrich. He's going to give a midterm election analysis, and that'll be at 7 p.m. And then on Veterans Day, that'll be at 11 a.m., November 11th. We have among the largest and patriotic ceremonies in Orange County, or in Southern California, and our keynote speaker that day will be Bud McFarlane, who served as a national security aide on the Nixon staff, but he also served as a national security advisor to President Reagan. Now to our distinguished speaker. Luke Nichter has a pretty impressive resume. Not only is he a professor at Texas A&M University, but he's also one of the founders of C-SPAN's American History TV, and he's also an expert on the Nixon tapes. He's compiled something like 5,000 pages of discussions within the Nixon White House, and he's compiled them in this new book, The Nixon Tapes, which he's co-authored with historian Douglas Brinkley. Unfortunately, Douglas Brinkley couldn't be here tonight, but Luke is great, and like I said, he's an expert on the tapes, and he's compiled them all in this great book with Douglas. Experts from all over the country and the world seek Luke's advice and counsel on the Nixon tapes. News organizations, scholars, and authors. Leading the discussion tonight is Frank Gannon. He was an Oxford-educated historian. He joined the White House staff in 1971 as a White House fellow. And then he went on with the president to San Clemente after he resigned and helped him write his memoirs. So I welcome to the stage Frank Gannon and Luke Nichter.
You sit over there.
Oh, okay. All right.
This was the Brinkley chair. You're in for a great treat, although we miss Doug Brinkley. Luke is, you're going to find him fully satisfying and sufficient. And he certainly is an expert on this material. So we're here tonight. Is that as loud as it sounds to me? We're here tonight to discuss the Nixon Tapes, the new book by Douglas Brinkley and Luke Nichter. It's a remarkable book. It represents a prodigious amount of work. It's a cornucopia of information, much of it new, all of it unedited, which is an important quality, and available in one place for the first time. It's also a functional and utilitarian book because after it has satisfied citizens and scintillated scholars, it is very handy as a doorstop. So let's begin at the beginning. They say, so kudos and congratulations to Brinkley and Nichter, and since Brinkley isn't here, they all go to Nichter. They say that there are 6 degrees of separation between any two people on the planet. But in the case of this book and in the case of you and Doug Brinkley, the degree of separation was what, about 500 yards on Cherry Street?
It's true. Doug and I didn't really start to work or collaborate on this until a few years ago. And I remember having a talk with my mother one day. She said, we knew a family of Brinkleys who grew up down the road in Perrysburg, Ohio, the suburb of Toledo. And as it turns out, the Brinkleys and my mother's side of the family grew up where they were neighbors on this little street in this little town. And then now Doug and I live near each other in Texas. And so it was this perfect way to kind of, it was a partnership that took no effort because we had this common background, and everything really flowed easily from the very beginning. We had all these common friends and common family members who knew each other.
How did you get interested in Richard Nixon?
I've never had to reconstruct that before, but I think it's, I think when you're a college student, when you're a graduate student, it doesn't matter whether you're studying geology or history or political science, it really doesn't, the field doesn't matter. I mean, in my case, it was history. But it's emphasized so strongly that you have to specialize in something. You have to do original research in something. Ideally, you become very good at what you do, whatever that something is. And for me, because history, in many ways, we say journalists write the first draft of history because they have contemporary sources, and that's what they're doing. They're writing stories each day. Many of them become the first memoirists and biographers, and then political scientists, and then historians kind of do the mopping up job decades later. And it takes decades because for most national security records of any White House, not just Richard Nixon's, but those before him and those since him, it takes 30 to 50 years most of the time for records to become out, to be in the library, for researchers to look at. And as I was starting this around 2003, 2004, you rewind the clock about 30 years, that's around the time it takes. And you kind of write in the Nixon, Ford, end of LBJ even was pretty recent. That was new to historians because the records were just becoming available. And I started to look into it with no particular interest. I mean, I grew up in a family that very much would have been the target of Nixon's 1972 campaign, kind of a middle class to working class, very blue collar. My parents were post office employees, union, Catholic, kind of socially conservative from Ohio in a very Rust Belt part of the state. And rewinding the clock, it makes sense now in hindsight that I was kind of a target of those who I think to whom Nixon would have appealed. But rewinding the clock as a graduate student placed me right in that period of years. And as you're looking at the records coming out, there's been, how many books written about Watergate or Vietnam or China to some degree. But then you look at the Nixon tapes, and other than the snippets that have come out over the years in a documentary here or a film there about Watergate, and I figured out, I know this now, I didn't know this then, they're about 5 to 7% of the total tapes. If you add up all of the Watergate, all of the abuse of government power material. Now you could say they're an awfully important 5 to 7%. They resulted in the only resignation of a president, of course, we all know that, but you still have the other 90-some% left. And I thought to myself, this is really difficult. They're hard to hear. It took me about 6 months to learn the voices. Nixon's is easy to know. Kissinger has a very easy to decipher, sometimes, voice. But there are others that are just terrible. The example I always give is you have a cabinet room full of Southern congressmen, and they all sound like Wilbur Mills of Arkansas. And even the State Department would call me and say, can you make out the voices on some of these recordings? And I can't make out the voices. And if I can't make them out, I don't know. There are a few others who can, maybe except for Marge Hacker. But we can't all just call her all the time every time we have a question. And so rewinding the clock back 30 years, I thought there's a pretty fruitful area here for research. And when I got done starting the website, digitizing the tapes, it's a work that there's enough still to do. I could be doing it the rest of my life easily.
So it's one thing, well, you've described sort of how you came to Nixon. It's another thing, you're a young man in your mid to late 20s. Presumably you have something of a life. What leads you to then set up NixonTapes.org, which is a great labor?
Well, and it's the only website today, NixonTapes.org, where you can listen to all of the digitized tapes today. And the National Archives doesn't have a copy of them. The Nixon Library doesn't have a copy. All tapes that are released since the library became federalized here have been put online. But all the ones before that, 2,000 hours or so, have not. And the only place still is the website, even in 2014. Why I did it, I was not in the business of websites. I had no desire, no interest to do it. It happened. It's a little bit like Edmund Hillary. Why did I climb it? Because it was there. Because somebody needed to do it. And for me, it was, you're writing your dissertation, your master's thesis, you're spending 6 months, sometimes a period of years working on a topic, and you finally kind of, French President Georges Pompidou always said, conception's far more fun than giving birth. And you finally give birth to this child, this dissertation or this master's thesis, and you think to yourself how hard it was to be the first one to transcribe a lot of these tapes, and there must be a better way, selfishly for me, but perhaps for others. And so I made a promise to myself that when I finished the dissertation, I would not only put online, I would start by putting online what I used in my own work, in part so I could access it easily. It was available for me, but also for others, given it's the web. But then start to fill in the gaps in the collection. And so from 2005 or so to about 2009, digitized around 2,000 hours of Nixon tapes. And that has to be done in real time. So you have to play it out, had to be played out from reel to reel to a DAT tape. So multiply that times 2,000 hours. And then from there, play it out again in real time, from DAT tapes into a computer hard drive, basically. And then you had to convert all those files, and there's only 20 or 30,000. It's about 16 terabytes of audio for those who are technically fluent. And then uploading that, and so you're to a server, and so you're uploading a batch of files, and you're coming back to check on the status about once every 2 weeks. Just to see if it's gone through yet, and if not, then you add more and so on. So it was a massive project. It really wasn't hard. It just took sort of a sustained level of interest and time, and anybody could have done it. And in fact, I mean, nothing unique about me, because if you really look at it, there were people far more qualified than me to have done that. You really needed two skill sets. You needed to know the history well enough of the Nixon era to know what you're doing. I mean, you could recognize the basic voices and what they're talking about at a given time. And there are people who knew that far better than me as a student in my 20s. And you had to have the technical expertise to be able to edit audio and convert output in certain formats and upload things and create websites. And there are definitely people who have a greater skill set than me on that front. But I think in hindsight, I was the only person that could do both passably well. And so it became really me who ended up doing it. So it was starting the website, and then that was just a sort of selfish tool, so I didn't have to travel to the archives anymore in College Park or eventually out here to transcribe them. Now I could sit at home in my pajamas or sit comfortably and listen to these, and so could the rest of the world too. And so that had to be done first before you could even start transcribing to make a book like this.
What was the subject of what was your master's thesis that you used the tapes on?
Master's thesis, I started to use tapes, and there ended up not being a lot of tapes. I was focused on kind of U.S.-European affairs because it hadn't been done. So much had been done in Vietnam and every other subject, Watergate, China. And so I thought, let's go a different direction. And sometimes that pays off, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes there's a reason why no one else has done a topic. And it's not always because it's really great and just undiscovered. Sometimes it's terrible. But in this case, the master's thesis was on expansion of the European community or European Union. It was a political science master's, so it was a little more contemporary. Expansion of Europe to East and Central Europe for the first time, the former communist bloc. And then when I got into the dissertation, kind of went back in time to look at transatlantic relations during the Nixon years. And no one had done that before.
And that was very important. The president's first trip, 2-3 months in March after the January inauguration, was to Europe to sort of square that circle and reassure the allies who had felt very deserted by the Johnson administration. So it was very much in Nixon's mind.
Before the president spoke to Congress, he spoke to the parliamentarians of our closest allies in Europe. And it was an incredibly important trip, not just for symbolism, but also for substance.
What was your PhD dissertation?
It was in that subject. It was U.S.-European relations, focusing on Nixon and NATO, which still hasn't been done to this day. Nixon and the collapse of the gold standard in Bretton Woods. It focuses on expansion of the European community, as it was called at that time, to include Britain, and bilateral relations with France, Germany, and with France, Germany, and Britain.
And am I giving something away for people who are looking for Christmas gifts in 2016 or 15, or people who are building a library, that if you think this is a book from Cambridge University Press in late 15, 16,
Yeah,
early
it'll
16?
probably be late fall. It'll be on the fall 15 list of Cambridge University Press.
Will be?
Nixon in Europe, the reshaping of the post-war Atlantic structure.
So,
And it's smaller than this book. So you don't need a bigger stocking to get one.
or you need a smaller door. So this website, nixontapes.org, which I recommend anybody to go to because it's very well maintained and very well presented and can be endlessly entertaining to listen to these things, became sort of the go-to, and it became and still is the go-to source for Nixon tapes. What was the reaction to it?
Well,
What has been the reaction?
If I was a better marketing person, I would track who uses it better. Because every book that comes out now on President Nixon, every Nixon aide who's written memoirs, and a bunch of them have in recent years, you can't write about that time of your life without consulting the tapes. And unfortunately, I don't collect any personal data, I don't know who the users are, but the reaction has been, I thought I was choosing a very narrow, sort of selfish research topic. It was a means to an end. I was going to transcribe and listen to as many tapes as I needed to, but keep it to a minimum so that I could finish a degree. And it became not a longer work, but it became a journey with Nixon. I mean, something I never could have planned. In a way that, I remember, there was a day, it started to dwell on me, that this was bigger than I realized, and more important than I thought it was. I remember I was sitting in the basement of, this is in the Bowling Green State University History Department graduate student carols. These are not very luxurious places to work. Flood prone, there's no phone down there. The building's 100 years old. Wi-Fi was a new thing, and it was impenetrable to every Wi-Fi and cell phone signal you can get. And I walked upstairs to check my mailbox or something upstairs, the main history department office. And the secretary hands me a note and says, Henry Kissinger's office just called for you. And here's the information. I thought, yeah, right. This is probably my roommate wanting me to think I'm as important as I think I am, working on these tapes. And so I kind of put it away and don't pay a lot of attention to it. And I look later, and let's check into it later when I had time. Last couple of Dr. Kissinger's books thank this person in the back of the book. So I thought, well, maybe this is real. And it was a 201 area code, which I kind of loosely knew was kind of New Jersey, near New York, but not quite New York. And I knew he was in New York. So I called, and she picked up the phone, and she said, Dr. Kissinger would like to meet with you as soon as you can. And wouldn't say why. And I'm thinking, how does one find out about when a graduate student is working on something, and how does that merit a face-to-face meeting? And so I thought, well, who do I know who's met with Henry Kissinger? The list wasn't very long. And so I called, I remember it was James Rosen of Fox News. I emailed James, and I know him better now. I barely knew him then. And of course, he had working for years on this John Mitchell book. He said, if you can get a meeting with Henry Kissinger in less than 5 years, you're doing better than the industry average, was the advice he gave me. I said, well, I have a meeting scheduled right now. And the funny part of the story is I called up, and so we set the meeting, and it was only a couple days later. I'm still in the euphoria of that moment. I had no idea whether to be euphoria or to be scared to death about what's about to happen. And I realized I had to cancel the meeting. I had a conflict I wasn't aware of because I just, casually made this commitment as fast as I could before he decided, he reconsidered. And I realized I had a wedding to go to, and it was my wedding. This was late March of 2008, and we were getting married. We got married. It actually did happen as a result of April 5th, and I would have been in deep trouble had I traveled to New York just before then, with the risk of not getting back in time. And the weather was terrible. The winter never ended up north that year, and so I finally rebooked. He was very gracious. Went up there in June. And I walk in his office, and he directs me to, he's sitting down in the corner, and he directs me to a seat, and which I later learn is the same seat that Sarah Palin sat in, only a week later, because she was touring around kind of wanting to be seen with kind of foreign policy gurus during the '08 campaign. She'd just been nominated, or was about to be nominated, rumored to be nominated. And he looks up at me as I'm putting my cell phone away, and he says, "No recording devices." And I guess if you're there to talk about Nixon tapes, it's fair game to be concerned about recording devices. And I say, "No, I'm just putting my phone away so we're not disturbed." And then finally he says, "Why are you here?" And I'm thinking, well, I mean, you called the meeting. I mean, I don't know why I'm here. And so we sit down, and it's a 20-minute meeting, and it's just before lunch, so I know my time is not long for this world. And I have a colleague with me, and we have a few, just in case, a few clips, the tapes ready. For any, the chance of getting to the tapes is about 1 in a million. But I sit down, we get served the office is all Chinese motif. It's very classy. I mean, very well done, professional, really well, get a traditional Chinese tea service laid out for us. He has a young, attractive British note taker in the room, taking notes on a steno pad. And he looks at me and he says, and these are the kinds of words you never forget. And he says, "If you want to know the policies of the Nixon administration, you have to study the memoranda between the president and myself." He said it just like that, kind of matter-of-factly. And kind of let it breathe for a moment, but I said, well, with all due respect, I mean, the tapes show a process, all options considered, kind of which one won out, how you reflected after the fact, kind of that day, later that day, sometimes a year later in some cases. And a memo is written by a person often who wasn't there, and a very polished document to be preserved for scholars decades from now. And nothing like a conversation. And so I explained, he said, I explained this to him as nicely as I could, and he said, "Give me an example." And so I said, well, I'll give you an example. We know now, this was new information then, it's not new information now, that he also recorded his conversations, his phone conversations. It wasn't a recording system like Richard Nixon's. It was secretaries listened in. As quickly as they could, they would make a transcription of a phone call. At the library here, they're called the Kissinger telcons. And he kind of perked up because that was news. And I said, but when you went to the Oval Office, as he often did, and President Nixon would say, get so-and-so on the phone, and this, get Ambassador Dobrynin on the phone, and you tell him X, Y, and Z, whatever it is. I have a copy of that, but you don't, because I've digitized these tapes. And he said, give me an example. So long story short, we went over an hour after the end of the meeting, past lunchtime. He cleaned me out of clips. He listened to everything I brought with me. I should have brought more. And in the very end, he was very nice. He was, I think, because you have to remember, and I'll wrap this up, he wrote 30 years ago in his memoirs, the tapes have little historical value. Because how can it be fair when one person in the room knows there's a recording and nobody else does? Well, he's thinking mainly about himself. And how valuable can that be for researchers? And I would argue, well, that's pretty valuable no matter who knows about the recordings. And I think in some small way that meeting turned him around. And in his memoirs, he still stands by today, the tapes, he says, will only be useful to a few indefatigable listeners, is the term he uses. And I'm proud to say that I have a photo of him from that meeting on my office wall at Texas A&M, to Luke, to an indefatigable listener.
How then there's so much to talk about and so little time, rather than digressing on, well, I'm going to digress on that, because he mentions that, and then a couple of reviews, including a very prominent review of your book, surprised me, because they came, and it in particular came from an historian who questioned the value of tapes in a sort of definitive way, that they are valueless, which strikes me as a peculiar notion for an historian. I could see saying that they're inadequate, or that they need to be supplemented, or that they are what they are, but to sort of dismiss them as part of the historical record strikes me as small minded and almost anti-historical. But they do have limits. They are what they are. What are they?
Well, as much as I'd like to say this is a perfect representation of Nixon's presidency, there are many drawbacks to tapes. I still think we're better off having them than not having them. The taping system ran only from 71 to 73, so it's not the entire presidency. They're audio tapes, so we don't get nonverbals, we don't get, they're not videotapes. The sound quality is pretty hard to hear sometimes, and so you have to make, I don't like to make guesses, but sometimes you have to leave unclears, or you don't like to, you don't want to make errors of fact. So there are all kinds of drawbacks. I mean, in the same way that if 2.5 years of our own private phone conversations one day, maybe the NSA will make these all available one day, if they haven't already. There are all kinds of drawbacks to an audio source. I mean, listening, transcribing is very much an active interpretation sometimes. I mean, you have to make judgments about not just what people say, but how they say it is important. A transcript is sort of a two-dimensional rendering of a three-dimensional act or conversation. And you get kind of what is said, but you don't get the intensity of what's said at different times. So there's all sorts of drawbacks. I mean, lists and lists. But I still would say that this is in many ways a unique source. I mean, I think all presidential records are flawed. If you're studying those memoranda between Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon, you get part of the story. If you're listening to the Nixon tapes, you get part of the story. If you're looking at other memcons and things, you get part of the story. I think where the tapes help us do best as historians of the Nixon White House is when you can't look at one or the other in isolation. If you're doing the traditional research of the memcons, of the memorandas, and then now you're informed enough to listen to the tapes, it takes research to a whole nother level. But you certainly can't do research in one or the other.
I think it's interesting that the two pieces of advice that President Johnson gave President-elect Nixon in November after the election, during the transition, when Nixon went down to the White House, was Johnson gave him two pieces of advice. One was to keep J. Edgar Hoover. He said, as director of the FBI, he said, in a city of weak men, he is a pillar of strength. And the other advice was to keep the taping system, which Johnson had all over the place. Nixon, in his memoirs, talks about going to bed the first night in the family quarters, and he puts his, as he says, he put his slippers under the bed, and he noticed a wire coming out, and Johnson had his bedroom taped, which was largely because he did a lot of work on the phone in bed. But Nixon had them all taken out, so he didn't take Johnson's advice. And then in a typically Nixonian way, when he finally took the advice in February of '71, he made a fateful decision, which was that you would record everything. It would be voice activated. Mm-hmm. The Kennedy and the Johnson systems were manually activated, so they only, Nixon called that window dressing, that wasn't taping, that was window dressing. You would only record something when you were ready to be heard by history, when you were creating a record for posterity, not a record, or your record for posterity, not a record for history. And some of them I think are funny, because Truman's, who did very little taping, he inherited a cumbersome system of FDR, but his microphone was in the lampshade on his desk, and Eisenhower's had a phony phone on his desk, which was the microphone. And then Johnson actually had the microphones embedded in places in the wall sconces and such like, as Nixon and Kennedy did as well. But so the unique thing about the Nixon tapes is that they are not just voice activated, sound activated. Mm-hmm. So when Marge came into the office to leave papers on the desk, that movement could have activated. How many of the 37 hours are prime historical material?
It's an impossible question. Out of 3,700 hours, how many are truly historic? How many are worth transcribing one day? Because even with a book like this, I started by saying 5 to 7% had been transcribed or published of Watergate or abuses of government power. Even with this book, as much of a doorstop as we've been told it is, we might have taken that percentage to 10 or 12%. I mean, I have a few thousand other pages that haven't been published. But there's still a good, and I'm taking, each time I go through the tapes, I take the cream off the top. So we're getting, what's coming out now is what I think is the best of the best. But I would say, there are 3,000 hours released today out of 3,700 hours. The remaining, there's still 700 to 800 hours, believe it or not. More than LBJ taped in total, more than Kennedy taped in total, have yet to be released by the National Archives. And there's a variety of restrictions. Some of it's national security, some of it's privacy of a living person who was recorded or discussed, talked about, privacy of the first family, which every former president gets a right to assert over certain records. So it's kind of a basket of different restrictions, some of which overlap on these 700 to 800 hours. Of the 3,000 hours that are open, I would guess there's at least another 1,000 hours that are still worth transcribing, whether it be additional on foreign policy. Economic policy is the next one. I've probably done the most, but that's wide open. And then domestic policy. And of course, there are many fewer domestic policy conversations as compared to 2 and 3 hour sessions at a time on China and Soviet Union and Vietnam. But they're still there. I mean, there's still something there worth transcribing. So I guess another probably 1,000 hours. One day, I can't do them all, but somebody will do them one day.
This book, what it is and what it is not, you're describing it as there's not much. There's some gold standard, very interesting and new, fascinating material actually about the gold standard, but it's mainly foreign policy. It is also not, except for a very bare minimum, Watergate.
Right. Yeah, we had to decide. This book, when it started, was about this high. The first draft was around 1,600 pages, single-spaced, and our contract was 500 pages. I mean, could you imagine doing the Nixon tapes in 500 pages? And so we got it through some negotiation up to closer to 800, but you had to make a decision. And so we decided we wanted to leave space to do a second volume, if possible, if the first one did well enough. And so this one we focused on 71 and 72, and we're now working on a kind of follow-up volume on the 73 tapes. And that was an easy way to break it. You'd think that doesn't seem, there's not a lot of symmetry there, 2 years and 1 year, but it actually is, because when the Nixon taping system began in February of 71, it didn't start firing on all cylinders. It started small and grew over time. He liked it so much in the Oval Office that he added the EOB, and then he added the Cabinet Room, and then he added various telephones, then he added Camp David. And so it wasn't firing on all cylinders, all locations, actually, until the summer of 72. So the tapes are much heavier toward the end in terms of the day-to-day minutia of the president's job. So this was an obvious break. One, because at the end of any presidential term, aides are leaving, aides are coming, there's a change in policy momentum. Because of Watergate, the war was over at the end of the first term. Watergate was primarily a 73 and later topic, so for a variety of reasons, it made sense to do 71 and 72, and then keep 73 separate. So that's what we'll do.
And you're thinking that could be or will be a subsequent volume?
We've gotten a verbal yes from the publisher, so we're planning as though it's going to happen.
We have a couple of, just as you brought for Dr. Kissinger, we have a couple of examples. I think people have generally, well, if they've visited the library, they've heard examples of the tapes. But just for you to explain some of the things that you deal with as a transcriber, we have a brief clip that most of them are, as you can imagine, are very serious. This one is not, well, there's a serious undertone, but ostensibly it's not serious. And Henry Kissinger has just come back. It's in April of 1972, before the Soviet summit that's coming up. And Henry Kissinger has come back from a scouting trip. Do you remember?
He's come back. He's advanced the trip for the president. Nixon is about to become the first person to stand in the Kremlin and shake the hand of the Soviet leader. It was a triumph. They were going to sign SALT I. It was a very serious moment at a very serious moment in the Cold War. And but what you hear on the tapes are not all serious policy discussions. These guys have some fun sometimes. They rib each other, they joke, and this is an occasion. Kissinger had this image, an image that he enjoyed very much as a ladies' man. Always appearing with actresses and celebrities, negotiating with the enemy during the day, but having a nice time at night. And so he's coming back, and they're teasing him a little bit about that image.
And the voices are the president, Rosemary Woods, and Henry Kissinger.
Where the hell do you think Kissinger was over the weekend when I was trying to call him?
Probably out with some base.
I hope so. I hope so.
He probably was.
It wasn't through, I tell you one thing, Mr. President, it wasn't through lack of office.
Oh, my word.
No, there, it's got nothing to do with modesty. The head of their state security, General Antonov, greeted me at the airport and said he had a whole bunch of girls, all 25 years and younger.
You might remember that's how they got so out from.
Yes, I know.
Girls? Not the girls.
The crudeness of these guys is not to be believed. Then I said I want to take a swim, and that's also under the state security. So again, then they said, do I want masseuses? You know,
Nurse?
masseuses. They said,
Oh, they use those for that purpose?
yeah, oh God, and they said, hey, hair color, but they did it.
Jesus Christ.
You know, it's so revolting. You know, it's all fun out of it. You know, it was just absolutely revolting, and they brought it up on every occasion. General Antonov was riding in the shotgun in the car all the time. He's handling your security too, Mr. President, we went past the Moscow film studios, and I said, I know a lot of actresses in Hollywood. He said, try my girls, they got a lot more experience.
So let me explain.
Well, let me first
Yeah.
say, now you see what Luke was up against, because am I the only person to whom that sounded like with occasional Teutonic?
If you're sitting in front of a computer and you have the speaker sort of right here, it's much easier to hear. But in a nutshell, what Dr. Kissinger says was that the head of the Soviet state security says, we know you have friends in Hollywood and actresses, and he says, try my girls, they have a lot more experience. And he says, any hair color you want. And so he's over there planning for the president's visit. We're going to meet here, and then next we'll have a session here. And all along the way, they're offering him companionship during his schedule. And what you hear the president saying is, that takes all the fun out of it.
I think it's also funny, there's at the very beginning when he talks about that they were throwing actresses at him, Rosemary Woods says, Henry, you're so modest. It's an interesting example of the dynamic, but it's also an interesting example. Imagine listening to 3,700 hours or hundreds of hours of that and and that was an easy one, yes. In fact, because the voices are fairly distinct, although they're somewhat layered. This book, the Nixon Tapes, is an embarrassment of riches. It will be a resource. It's a pleasure now to dip into. It's not really a book that should be, I think you would agree, you would have to be more than indefatigable to read it cover to cover, and that's not what it's meant. It's meant to dip into, because it's divided into tapes, and each tape has a brief introduction setting up the context, and the date is there, and the voices. And I think the general division of labor was that Doug Brinkley did the prose, did the brief introduction, and then did those connective tissues, and you are the tape guru, so you did the tapes.
And we had to make an important decision when we had to, first of all, it was too large in an early stage to publish, but we had to, in an early stage, there was far more kind of setup before the conversations, the introduction was longer, there was a lot more of us and less of the tapes. And at the end, we had to make edits, like any book. And there was a moment I remember I thought, what can I say that's more important than just, why would I take tapes out to put me in? What's more important? Me talking about the tapes or just letting readers read what's on the tapes? And I think sometimes historians start to think that they're more important than their own subject. And that was a point that I didn't want to go in the book. So we tried to keep the editorial comment to a minimum. Our goal here was to call balls and strikes and to let readers come to their own conclusions, and they're not our conclusions.
And you also kept the editorial comment, but also the editing to him. There have been a couple of books, most recently John Dean's book, in which he has claimed, probably correctly, that he has listened to and transcribed all of the tapes that, however tangentially, deal with Watergate. And I think his figures, I'm making these up, but they're roughly that something like 240 tapes are known, but there are several hundred tapes that deal with Watergate in the broadest context. And so that he has listened to all of those. So that's a Herculean task, and he started in 2009, and he had people helping him do it, and they digitized and did all this. But then, he won't put it online, which is, I think, a mistake for history, but maybe he has reasons for that. But then he edits within his editing. So what you get is his edited version of his edited tapes, and then they're arranged in what I would think, and I think most people, whether you like it or not, is a tendentious manner because he's making a case. So one of not the least virtue of this book is that there are, I didn't see any ellipses. Is this an ellipses free zone?
Well, going back, when you're starting with a book, you have so much material, you had to make kind of certain editorial judgments at the beginning that you know you could consistently follow. What you don't want is halfway through to decide, there's a better way to have been doing this all along. And that's the problem. Most tapes book use frequently sort of ellipses or other editing marks. And the problem with those is you don't know whether the content missing with that little ellipses is a word or 5 pages in some cases. So what we tried to do in this book, it's different than all other presidential tapes books, Kennedy's, Johnson, or Nixon, is if you take a whole transcript, say from an hour-long conversation, and it weaves in and out of the subject you want, let's say China, then in foreign policy, you're back in China 20 minutes later, then you're dealing with White House personnel issues. What we tried to do was give the reader the completely intact sections of China here, China there, and within the sections, so we'll get rid of the domestic policy of the personnel, but leave the sections unaltered with no ellipses, no editing, which it asks a lot of a reader. It's hard to read transcripts, and we knew that before we did this book, but I think it's a lot more honest in its approach.
As I say, this is an embarrassment of riches, and so selfishly, but the time is passing and we do want to have time for questions. So I'll give you a smorgasbord of things that I was going to ask you, and you can choose the ones that, a core of it deals with the 72 summit, the summit in Moscow in June of 72. And that period, sort of February, March, April, May, it's a thriller. You know how it's going to turn out, but it really is a thriller reading, being a fly on the wall in the Oval Office and being able to see day by day the roller coaster of policy and the problems with the war and the Soviets and the Chinese. It's a microcosm because it deals then with American public opinion. It deals with the basis of Nixon's foreign policy, which was that he could have been a hero, as he says on one of these tapes. Does he say it to Billy Graham that I could have got out, and I was advised to get out?
He said, who knew better than me from a political standpoint that January '69, cut and run, flush it down the drain, and could have blamed Kennedy and Johnson.
So, and he says, I could have been a hero like Ike then, who went to Korea, but that it was the wrong thing to do because it wasn't just dealing with Vietnam, it was dealing with Japan, and dealing with the Middle East.
Our allies in Europe, because we have troops stationed there, hundreds of thousands, and what does that say about our resolve and our role as the leader of the free world if we're going to so easily bail out on a commitment elsewhere?
So there's that. We could talk, you can talk a little bit about that. I think one of the fascinating things here, it's a story that's out, but it's sort of hiding in plain sight. The fact that the Defense Department, essentially, but particularly the Joint Chiefs of Staff, were spying on the White House. The incident of the Navy yeoman who was going through Henry Kissinger's burn bags at night and through Al Haig's briefcase and copying this material and sending it over to the Pentagon, to the particularly Admiral Moore, to the Joint Chiefs. And the way Nixon finds out about this and the way he deals with it is fascinating and masterful and strategic. So there's that. There's the I think the striking thing that Nixon at one point says that maybe when he thinks that the summit may go down and that the war may not be over, that all these things, that all these balls that he's keeping in the air, China, Russia, ending the war, may all come crashing down, and that it's important. And so the election, he would lose the election. And he actually talks about bowing out, maybe for the good of the country. I should bow out, because if I remove myself, we could find a nominee. And he goes through, well, if you decide to choose this, to open this door, then you can say the nominees that he mentions could be chosen. There's the stuff about the gold standard. And then there's, as a subset, there's that I thought was really interesting because of what he says about the service and the way people who served in Vietnam, the way the public and the people who served in Vietnam will look back on it. He meets with John O'Neill, who was then, as later, John Kerry's nemesis. He was part of the
Swift Boat Veterans for Truth.
He was a swift boater, and then before swift boating became a term of art, he was a swift boater. And he comes into the Oval Office for a conversation with Nixon. And what Nixon, it's really, it's powerful. I mean, you can agree or disagree with the analysis, but Nixon's analysis is logical and strong and strategic and courageous. Again, agree with it or disagree with it, because it was what he believed. It was unpopular, and he had a long view. He tells them that it may take a while and it may take some luck, but people eventually will have a different view about the people who served in Vietnam. That is, he says, they're not all drug addicts, and they're not all brutes and savages. Well, I've given that one away. So, and then generally, did I say China? You give a whole new thing here, a new thing in this book about the genesis and the rate of the opening to China, the ping-pong diplomacy.
Well, there's so much to talk about. I think one of the most fascinating things, as a historian, I think, wouldn't it be great if all presidents were taped, even today? Even if we had to seal them for 50 years or 75 years until they're no longer classified, but we could eventually know everything. This is a book that should never have been written. These recordings were Richard Nixon's private property. He expected they would be treated like those before him who recorded. Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson. And they got to keep their own recordings. They were private material. He fully expected he would retire out here and build his library, and he would write his multi-volume kind of Churchillian memoirs like Churchill did after World War II. This is what's so special about the tapes is not just that there'll never be another tapes like this as far as we know. We assume presidents have learned their lesson since Richard Nixon. But it was such a pivotal moment in the country's history. We were getting out of our longest war. I mean, the structure of power was changing. A little thing like Bretton Woods, totally overlooked, the end of the gold standard. Most economists today, for better or for worse, say this decision was the beginning of the modern global financial system. And it happened in 1971, squeezed in between the announcement he was going to China and his plans for the Soviet summit. Well, he changed the world economy forever. So it's just a remarkable kind of list of things that are in here that have never, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. We give you kind of the best one of this and the best one of that. And I remember one time our editor said, you've got 50 conversations dealing with the timing of the Soviet summit. When are we going to go? And they weren't talking about the shape of the table, but it was down to that level of detail. If you have 50 conversations, how many can you keep? And sadly, you can probably keep one or two in a book like this. So this book, the most gratifying thing for me is I think you're right. I saw the book for sale yesterday in LAX. And I think, I wouldn't even buy a book like this at LAX. It's heavy, it's big, the carry-on sizes keep getting smaller from airlines. And this book is going to lead to all kinds of people like me, writing master's theses and doctoral dissertations. We were writing, and Nixon in many ways was a recording for history. And this book was written for history. It's not meant to be read quickly and consumed that way. And then I think another thing that really strikes me about working on this book and all the subjects you mentioned is, why it's important to remember, why didn't Nixon burn these tapes when he had a chance? If it would have prolonged his presidency, if we could look back today and to know that Nixon would have been president till January of 1977, why wouldn't you have done that? And I think, the answer that I get listening to so many of the tapes is that Nixon loved history. He frequently cited books of history, favorite authors, routinely. I mean, someone will come into the Oval Office and did you read this? And he'll quote, sometimes even reads from books on the taping system, passages that are particularly instructive for whatever the moment is, whatever they're talking about. And I think in the end, he didn't burn the tapes because Nixon liked the gamble, the big play. China was a big play. Ending the gold standard was a big play. Going to the Kremlin was a big play. I mean, he liked that kind of take him by surprise and keep the press off balance. I think he, in a sort of sadistic way, he liked it when his advisors lined up and they all said one way, and then maybe you had John Connolly or someone saying, no, I think you ought to go another way. He'd love to go with a sort of minority report, on a particular policy. Here's the safe option. He went another way. Very calculated, very careful, not haphazardly. And I think that was very much like his reason to preserve these tapes. I think he was taking another gamble with history. He knew that it would be 20 years, well now it's 40 years, 50 years, could be 100 years until all of these tapes are transcribed and we have the whole story. But I think he was taking a gamble. No one knew better than him how damaging those tapes would be to his presidency. They ended his president. They were the smoking gun, ultimately. But I think he believed the reason not to destroy them was because once all these other stories got out, not that you would overcome Watergate, not that Watergate would go away in people's minds, but that there'd be something else that comes to mind besides Watergate when you think about Richard Nixon. There are all these other policies in here that are worth studying and will be studied in the future. So I think our contribution here is to get that started. This isn't the end, this is the beginning.
There are several, usually there's an elephant in the room, there are several elephants in the room, and some of the pre-publicity for this book, particularly the excerpts in Vanity Fair, have concentrated on some of the less seemly things on the tapes, and there's no doubt that there are things that are disturbing and things that are downright horrendous. Your colleague Doug Brinkley has talked about that the tapes rain anti-Semitism, and the people reading this book have said that it presents an anti-Semitic, racist, homophobic cynic who thought the American people were suckers. Kennedy obsessed, who thought the American people were suckers, based on one tape, the sucker tape. Do you want to, well, let's discuss, because it's there, how much of it is there? Is it raining? How characteristic of Nixon's obiter dicta is that, are they? How do you come away dealing with that?
This is hard as a historian because as a historian, you're trained so much to always have proper context for everything, no matter what it is. And in some ways, this book is a treasure. It gives us insight that we would never have otherwise. But the tapes also distort, because during this limited window of time, they give sort of a very intense view on certain things, not everything. And you have, every time the tapes have been released over the years, there's a couple hundred hours kind of drip, drip, drip that come out. There was a release in 07 and 08 and 09 and 2010, and there's still these hundreds of hours left. The first thing that the press go to are, did he talk about Jews? Did he talk about any other ethnic groups? And I think one thing I try to keep in mind, listening to the tapes and transcribing, is how much of that material is there compared to other policies. You think about all the comments he makes about ethnic groups, or let's say Jews, the labels given to him that he's an anti-Semitic. Well, first of all, he likes Israel, he likes Golda Meir, and I think Israel gives him great credit for saving Israel in 1973. And he has many friends who were conservative Jews, Republicans, that he liked a lot. They were friends of his. So right away, people give him a label. It's not really true. He didn't like liberals. He didn't like some liberal Jews because of their politics, not because they were Jewish. And you add up the material, and there's probably, out of 3,700 hours, of the 3,000 hours, and if I haven't listened to all of them, it's pretty close to all of them, there's probably 5 minutes of material total, comments on Jews. But that's the first thing that, of course, the press go for. And it's like that with many things. How are the press right when they say how vulgar he is, or do we think he's vulgar because that's the material they show us? I mean, these conundrums. They're very hard to work through these issues. LBJ on the Johnson tapes was far more vulgar. I mean, far more colorfully vulgar. Nixon really was kind of a sprinkling of four-letter words. In some cases, it's almost sort of like an adolescent, kind of learning how to swear, who is sort of wanting to impress the big kids at school or something, in the schoolyard. It's not the same type of kind of vulgarity that's preconceived. I mean, Johnson in many ways spoke like he was someone who never left the ranch, and he really never did in many ways. Nixon wasn't that way. So the problem is there's so many recordings that if you have 5 minutes of material about something, that can fill a whole press release. That can fill a whole news story when tapes come out. And then the stories are filed, and then they move on to the next story. And then everyone ignores everything else. So I think it's safe to say Nixon was not a saint. I don't think he's a saint. I don't think any president was a saint. He had flaws, and every leader has flaws. Are Nixon's flaws greater than other presidents? I'll leave that to the psychologists and the psychiatrists. I don't do that. I think you have to have the proper perspective and the right context for that material. This is 1970, not 2014. So I think there's a lot of things you have to keep in mind when you're listening and transcribing these. And you have to I think you have to constantly be aware of kind of what's appropriate for that time, and keeping in context the fact that there are 3,000 other hours of tapes out there.
Just before we go to questions, they say that no man is a hero to his valet, and you have become pretty close to, although he had Manolo Sanchez, but you have become, through the years of listening to this, probably you have become his intellectual valet. You probably know his mind, and certainly the way he expressed himself, and the way he thought is reflected in these tapes, because the book is a terrific insight into Nixon's mind and his thought processes. You also, except I think you and Marge Acker are the only two people who have worked for him or around him or in his materials who have never got into the doing anything in Nixon voice.
Well, I will say, I've played so many of these tapes in my house over the years. There are some days that my wife Jennifer, who would be here except for we have a little baby now, and she would say, "No Nixon today, please. Can we take a break from Nixon?" Because you're listening, and for a while you use headphones and then speakers, and you're going back and forth to try to find out the last couple words you can't quite get. And I've joked a couple times that our little baby is almost 5 months old, and she probably thinks Richard Nixon is her grandfather or something because she's heard his voice. So before you call Child Protective Services on me for putting that on her, this is a journey. It's really not a work, and I really mean that. I mean, I'm not an obsessive. I'm someone who, adamantly believes that the history has to be right one day, and it has to be proper and balanced and nuanced. And that doesn't mean covering up Nixon's flaws, but it means giving no more attention to those than I do everything else on the tapes.
In 25 well-chosen words or less, characterize Richard Nixon.
Nixon is different to different people. I mean, it's been said over and over, but I mean, you only get this when you listen to the news gives you a soundbite or a snippet or a film or a documentary. When you listen to Richard Nixon, there are some days, say when he's traveling out here or to Key Biscayne, we have no tapes because those locations weren't taped. But on days he spent, complete days, in the Oval Office or the EOB or Camp David, we literally have kind of his every waking moment on some days. And when you listen not to a soundbite, but not to a meeting or a complete phone call, but you listen to complete days, and complete days became weekends at Camp David, and complete weekends become weeks and months, what you see is sort of a different Nixon for different occasions. I mean, he's very different around his inner circle, Bob Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, Henry Kissinger, and just a couple of others. He's different again around members of Congress. There's a whole other side to him that the press didn't pick up on. He's meeting with POW wives, and he's he's warm and sort of, very pleasant. He did a lot of things that are on the tapes that he sought no publicity for, which is rare today in politics. There's all kinds of sides to Nixon, I think, that even most historians haven't discovered yet, and they're on the tapes. And you have to have listened, I think, to a sufficient sample size of the tapes to have heard all these and how they interplay between the different Nixons. But I think it's kind of a cop-out to say a president is complex, but he's as complex as any person I've ever heard before.
I think Chris Nordike is going to now conduct the questioning.
Let's give him a round of applause, though. First, that was an extremely interesting talk. Thank you very much. They have agreed to take some questions. So, does anybody have any? Got any questions? I have one. You're a historian, so you obviously had some deep research into President Nixon before you actually went into listening to the tapes. Did you have a sort of opinion of the president, and was that opinion altered dramatically after listening to the tapes?
I think my opinion, I did, first of all, I did not have a deep opinion of Richard Nixon, because I don't think I have a deep opinion of any political leader. I think most political leaders, even those of your own politics, whoever they happen to be, there are things you like and there are things you don't like about any politician, I think. And so I did not have a deep opinion, but I had a sense that most of what you hear about Nixon was very negative over the years. And I think once I got more and more into the tapes, I realized that there's all these tapes that have never been published or listened to or transcribed about important policies. And to me, I thought, I was surprised. When I started to listen to the Nixon tapes, and I'm using quotes because I thought the Nixon tapes were this long compendium of slurs and foul language. It's not what they are at all. The language is there, here and there, depending on who he's talking to. But these aren't the Nixon tapes that I knew. And so I think the more that I got into it, what I received was confirmation of both how, I think in some ways, how brilliant and forward-thinking he was. You're talking about China and foreign policy, the things he's known for. But also, how complex he is. He's clearly someone who had complex kind of personal issues. Again, I give limited judgment to those, but I think I come away with just really a deep respect, for who Richard Nixon was. And I take him as he is. I really try not to judge him.
We have a question right here.
Let's stand up.
It is said that when a decision reaches the president's desk, it's often a choice of a bad or worse decision. Can you give us a little bit of insight from listening to the tapes of how Nixon made decisions? What was his methodology? Did he consult advisors? Did he rely on his own judgment? That would be helpful. Thank you.
Sure. Well, and certainly the executive office of the president only has probably, 1,000 people working for the president. So a decision that gets to the president is one that 1,000 other people can't solve. So it is often bad or worse or very legally, financially complex. One in particular that stands out to me, that was kind of new to me working on the book, was, we look back now, especially young people, and they see 1972, the election, a 49-state landslide against Senator McGovern, one of the highest, whether it's by percent, whether it's by electoral votes, one of these absolute, landslides in political history. But yet what the tapes show is a different story. In 71, it did not look particularly good politically for Richard Nixon. And not only did it not look like a landslide, it looked like he might not get elected at all.
He didn't think he thought it was very likely that it would be a Nixon-Kennedy, Richard Nixon-Edward Kennedy race in 72.
And even though we'd had Chappaquiddick, he still thought that Kennedy would somehow emerge, maybe late in the election cycle.
And he felt that up until June, when McGovern scored the, whatever it was, the 1,519 delegates he needed to be sure the nominee. Nixon thought that he was a stalking horse for the Kennedy campaign.
So it strikes me, one particular problem was it didn't look good. The war wasn't going particularly well. The North Vietnamese, in Nixon's view, were being very intransigent. They were leaving the negotiating table. They weren't talking. Talks had broken down. At this stage, there was no summit to China. There was no summit yet to Soviet Union. It really didn't look good. A lot of the Nixon foreign policy at that moment in kind of the spring of 71 looked stalled to Richard Nixon. And Frank alluded to this before. He suggested to Henry Kissinger, I may need to bow out here for the better of the country. And that's a shocking thing to hear. You think, take President Obama, and during the worst days on health care, would he really have not run for re-election because of health care? Or, take whatever issue it is. I think that's silly. Of course he's going to stay in there for re-election. But that's the error, though, of thinking in sort of 2014 terms and not 1972 terms, because in 1972, just 4 years before, LBJ did just that. He went on television on March 31st and announced he would not seek re-election, and he would not accept the nomination if he were nominated by his party. And so I think in people at that time, that would have been kind of a realistic, possibly, idea to suggest. And Nixon talked about, Nixon was very much on the tape saying, if people can't, and I'm paraphrasing very loosely, but if people can't live with me as president, what they're going to get is either someone on the left who is going to pull out of the progress we've made with China and Russia and others. He said, or the party's just going to shift to the right, and they're going to get Reagan. And there's a lot of talk on the tapes, which has never been published, about Nixon's successor. And of course, had Watergate not happened, you wonder how much of this would have come through. He was paving the way for John Connolly, a prominent Democrat, governor of Texas, who seated in front of John F. Kennedy the day he was assassinated and injured, I think, in 5 different places himself, was going to change parties to the Republican Party. He was waiting to do so because he was, I think, various reasons, but he was polite to LBJ. He didn't want to do that while LBJ was alive. So he waited till after LBJ died in January of '73, and then he switched parties, and so did some others. But a lot of talk about the political future, renaming the Republican Party, abolishing the Republican Party, starting a new political party, talking about what that name might be, who it might be, a new majority that was being created, a political realignment. So fascinating kind of what ifs about history, and we'll never know because Watergate intervened and things changed. But just incredible kind of, you're listening to someone who's clearly, this is kind of a game of chess, and he's 5 or 6 moves in. If this, then that, if not that, then this, but if this, then that. All these scenarios and this kind of web, it's just kind of riveting and kind of fascinating to listen to at times because it's, I don't know if it's because of his legal training or what it is that allowed him to do that, but it's a rare skill for a human being to have.
Wasn't there also, it was generational, and as you say, it was of the time, but there was a sense of, I think he had a sense of duty, and his feeling was, and there's great quotes in here from him about that, can you imagine who would sit in this chair if I don't get reelected? Because at that point, he is saying, if the summit falls,
yes, the Democrats are going to win.
We're going to win.
Yeah.
And so he says, who would sit in this chair, and would they be strong for defense? Which is why he was thinking that he might have to step down so that someone who would be strong on defense, Connolly, would get in. But he says, can you imagine if Hubert Humphrey was here? He's a gibbering idiot, well-intentioned but gibbering. And Muskie has no character. Kennedy, Ted Kennedy, he's all over the place. And he says and he says that this is the last time it's possible. This is in another tape, I think. It's the last time that through the application of American power, peace could come to the world for 25 years. And he was, when Nixon talked about, he was a literal-minded man in many ways, and when he talked about a generation of peace, he was thinking about the biblical 30 years. And so when he says in that tape that with a person who understands power, American power, and is willing to use it, could bring peace and won't pull out of Vietnam, and we'll use it, we'll have the courage to use it, could bring peace for 25 years.
Well, in his idea, the way he had China, the purpose of China, the purpose of the Soviet Union, the purpose to make peace with the Soviets was to improve conditions now, to make an immediate upward adjustment, improvement in not just the American position in the world, but in the world itself. But China was 15 to 25 years from now. And he thought in those terms. There's no way he could have known what China would become, but he understood at a moment that it was not a new idea, the idea of making peace with China. Others had the idea, but he was the first to have the idea and the conviction to do something, to act on the idea. And it was a radical idea. And there's no way he could have seen, but he understood it was important to make peace with China because they're going to overtake us one day. They've already overtaken us. China's population then was 70 to 100 million. They're going to overtake us perhaps economically, perhaps militarily one day. Isn't it better to make friends with them on our terms while we're stronger than to continue to not recognize them, and then the peace, if it ever happens at all, will be on their terms? I mean, it's so simple. It makes so much sense. But no one had conceived of that or taken action on it. So you get so much into his thought process. I use this phrase, when you have a sufficient sample size of tapes and you've read about enough interactions where he's talking about these subjects. But he a lot of thought goes into these ideas and the momentum behind these policies.
We have time for one more question. I want to let everybody know, though, that Mr. Nichter will be out in the front lobby, available to sign copies of the book, which are for sale in the store. Here's our last question.
Yeah, just a quick question. I was wondering how you arrived at the choice for the cover photo.
The cover photo, and to let you know, the information about it is on the inside back here. But we first had a photo. It was just kind of a stock kind of photo of Nixon. It really didn't say much about him. And so I suggested, why can't we get a photo maybe that speaks to a location that was taped, or something that sort of suggests history more so than kind of a stock Corbis photo that a lot of books use. There have been a lot of other, this has been a summer of Nixon in many ways. A lot of Nixon books have been published this summer. Every single one, but ours, is red, black, gray, with white print, and kind of uses a stock photo. And several books have used this kind of attractive kind of photo as a skin that kind of wraps around recently. And we really like that effect. In this case, the King of Jordan doesn't appear in this book, and this photo was taken before the taping system existed. This is, I think, from the 70 meeting with the king. He's in some 73 meetings, which we're going to have, but a lot of that's national security classified still. But I think the idea was something that looked authentic, looked historic. It was in an actual location that was taped, and it looks kind of attractive. And of course, lined up against the gray, the black, and the red, it also screams at you in a bookstore, which doesn't hurt either.
May I ask, sir, why did you ask that question? It's a good question.
Yeah, I just noticed because well, obviously Nixon's in there, Kissinger, but I was wondering why he was saying, that King Jordan.
Yeah, it's just it was there, and also what's interesting is there's a fire in the fireplace, and most of the time when there would have been a meeting of this type, they would have been seated in front of the fireplace. But I think because the fire was there, they were in the couches, and so there's a sort of symmetry to the photo. It looked nicer among the options we looked at than some others. So. No great masterful reason. It appealed. It suggested history. It gives you a sense of one of the spaces that was taped.
Is it true that if you hold the cover under a black light, the microphone pop out? Or is that that's an urban myth?
That's right.
Thank you very much. Let's give him a round of applause. And again, like I said, Mr. Nichter will be available out in the front lobby to sign your books. Thank you.